What would it feel like to be free? Do you constantly try and make changes in your life but always slip back into old ways? I used to be constantly frustrated by my lack of willpower. What I never knew is that there was a reason why I could not control myself, and that there are processes that you can follow to regain your freedom. I interview some of the most knowledgeable and compassionate minds talking about breaking all varieties of bad habits and how to actually live a joyful and fulfilling life. Listen to the show and hit subscribe to free yourself from the shackles of the mind. And if you find some benefit, please share it with a friend and let's make the world a better place together. Welcome to the Break the Chain podcast. I'm here with Rachel Stonehouse. Rachel is an investigative reporter, which basically means journalist, for the BBC News and formerly for BBC NewsBeat. She recently produced and presented the documentary Young and Addicted, Generation Ketamine, which took a graphic look at the impacts of recreational ketamine use. For anyone who doesn't know, ketamine is a medical drug that's been used since the 1970s. It's safe in small doses and is effective in assisting the treatment of some mental health conditions. Ketamine is also popular as an illicit drug used in the UK, Europe, North America, and many countries in Asia, and is growing in popularity in Australia and New Zealand. The stats aren't really known about Africa and Latin America, but it's likely that it's used there, but not well reported. As stated in the documentary, government figures show that ketamine addiction has more than quadrupled since 2016 in England and Wales. What may not be common knowledge is that the drug has extremely serious health consequences. So, Rachel, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, James.
I was wondering if you'd mind giving us a bit of background about yourself and how you ended up being involved with the ketamine documentary.
Sure. So my background is largely working on investigations and I guess stuff that isn't really in the news, rather than things that are happening already. I've always been interested in the stuff that's maybe not being talked about, but we should be talking about. So yeah, I've got a background working on investigations. And then the last few years, I spent time working at NewsBeat, which is covering the news on Radio 1, 1Extra and the Asian network in the UK. So our target audience was people under the age of 25. And 1Extra is for sort of targeted at a Black audience, and Asian network an Asian audience as well. So it's pretty diverse, and yeah, very much a younger audience. And I guess as part of that, I covered quite a lot of stuff around drug use, drugs at festivals, that sort of thing, because it was the kind of thing that came up quite often. And I've always had an interest in looking into stories around addiction as well. So I've previously worked on a documentary about gambling addiction with women. It's an area that I don't think gets covered enough within the industry. And I think it's a lot more complex and complicated, as you well know, than some people think. And so it's always something that I'm kind of keen to explore. And then last year, sort of towards the end of 2023, I moved departments again, kind of back into investigations, which is when I guess started properly working on this documentary that I've just made.
That's really interesting. What is it that draws you towards working with addiction?
I think, as I say, I don't think it's an area that always gets covered enough within the industry. And I think it's really complex and there's a lot of layers to it. And sometimes that isn't always put across and understood. So I'm always keen to kind of get into that as well. And I just think it's important that we in the industry, but also the public, kind of understand as well addiction and the various layers to it in terms of how people end up being addicted to whatever substance it is, or it might be, something like gambling, which obviously is completely different. So I guess it's always just been something of like an area that I personally have been quite interested in. I've got family members and friends that have struggled with various addictions as well. And yeah, I guess like I'm always looking for stories that maybe aren't being talked about enough, but should be. And for me, like addiction, and particularly with this ketamine addiction, is just one of those things as well.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's of critical importance to deal with 15 years ago, 18 years ago, really, because it's just mind-boggling. It's just absolutely phenomenal how bad the health consequences are and how quickly they actually can have, an effect. I mean, you've spoke to a lot of people through doing this documentary. Was you shocked by the health consequences?
Yeah, I was. Like, I'm in my mid-30s, and I feel like when I was kind of growing up, if you want to use that term, and in my late teens, early 20s, ketamine was quite well known as like a horse tranquilizer. And I would say it wasn't that popular a drug with my generation. And so I knew a bit about it, but I didn't know loads. And I had absolutely no idea of the really serious like health implications it can have, particularly physically on the bladder. So like I learned a lot through making this documentary about it. And obviously it's not just the physical impact as well, it's then the mental like impact that it has as well in terms of on people's mental health, and kind of all of the other knock-on effects that go with it. And like for me, it's always really important when you're working on something like addiction to kind of break it down as well, because it goes so much further than just being, in my mind anyway, so much further than just being about someone's got addicted to something, because often there's like a reason behind why that addiction has started in the first place. And like what I found through making the ketamine documentary is, of all of the people I spoke to, the way that their addiction had kind of started was their usage was basically a way of often dealing with something that had happened in their lives, and that it was a way of kind of processing it. And obviously that is so often the case with addiction as well. And yeah, like I say, I just think it's an area that doesn't really get enough attention and focus. I think it's really important that we in the industry, but also the audience, like understand that as well.
Yeah, trauma's just like, it's common knowledge that trauma is underlying the majority of serious addiction, or some other reason. Mental health problems and things like that are so common. And even in my own life, I look at my own ketamine addiction, and I was a very anxious person, and me using ketamine, it temporarily masks anxiety a treat. It's fantastic at temporarily masking anxiety, at temporarily masking depression. When my best friend committed suicide, ketamine made me basically not have to deal with that. I didn't deal with it at the time. I'd completely buried myself in that. So you can see, and this is one of the reasons I think that it needs talking about right now, is because it's being promoted as a miracle drug at the moment. And when I introduced this podcast, I said one of the things that I tried to highlight is that it's very good at assisting with helping to treat mental health problems, because it doesn't in and of itself treat anything. It masks, it disassociates from the present and from the difficulty and the triggers of dealing, the intensity of triggers to deal with stuff, and it allows people to do therapy without getting triggered. It's not in and of itself a cure for anything, but it's also like, you've been in the subreddit forum that I'm a part of as well, the ketamine addiction, and you can see in there that there are people there who have gone in for ketamine assisted psychotherapy and medical use of it and are now addicted. So it is something that needs talking about a lot more now. So I'm so grateful that you have, done this documentary. It's really, I think it is the best one that has been made so far about ketamine, and it is very informative. What's been your feedback from people so far about the documentary?
Well, thank you. First of all, it's really good to hear, and I really appreciate it, because I know obviously a lot from your own experience, but also all of the people that you speak to and have had on the podcast and stuff. So it means a lot to hear that. So thank you. But yeah, we've had a really positive reaction to it, I have to say. You never quite know when you take on a project like this, how it's going to how it's going to go down and how people are going to respond. But actually, we found really positive feedback, both from all of the people that were involved in the documentary, but also from people outside as well. And I've had quite a lot of people get in touch just to say, like, thank you so much for doing this, or I've had a similar experience. And do you know what I found when I was like in the early stages of making it and reaching out to people to find out more about people's experience, I just was completely overwhelmed by the number of people that wanted to share their stories. And you don't always get that, you know, when you're making documentaries, especially around addiction, or if it's, you know, things that are really difficult to talk about and often involve trauma. Sometimes people can be really hesitant to want to speak out about that and put their face to it, understandably so. But I found with this, right from the outset, that actually people were really keen to speak out and share their experiences, and I guess maybe try and let other people know the things that they didn't realize when they first started using Ket. And that's kind of what I found with a lot of people, that they were really keen to like share their experiences because they don't want other people to end up in the same situation they've been through, which is like really, really admirable thing to want to do as well. So yeah, we've had a really positive reaction, and we've had a big reaction as well. Like, obviously it was a documentary, but it got a lot of news coverage as well. And the figures, you know, in the BBC, we can get quite obsessed with kind of the figures, the number of people reading the online articles, engaging in social media like Instagram, TikTok, or watching the documentary, and the figures have been pretty astonishing, which I think says a lot for actually how much this is a topic that people are clearly interested in. I mean, on the day the doc went out on iPlayer, it was the most read story on the BBC website for a lot of the day. And it beat, I mean, it was the day Taylor Swift released her new album, and which, you know, anything to do with kind of music industry, and Taylor Swift obviously does really, really well. And the story around ketamine was actually getting higher figures and was the most read story on the BBC website, overtaking Taylor, which I think, you know, speaks volumes for kind of the interest in the story. And also clearly it was something that people engaged with and wanted to read about, and you know, that's a great thing, I think.
I'm actually surprised about that. I wouldn't have expected that to be the case. I imagine you might be surprised about that too.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a good thing, I think, in terms of getting the story out there. But I think when you work on something like this and you spend a lot of time on it, you become really interested in it, and you want other people to be as interested as you are. You never quite know how it's going to go down and how the audience is going to engage. And also, like, sometimes, particularly when it's like in the news, there's other stories and other things going on in the world at that time, whether that be Taylor Swift or I think there was a lot going on in Iran and Israel on the day that this went out in the news as well, which obviously is a really important story. A lot of people interested in it. And so, you know, taking all those things into consideration, you never quite know how this kind of thing will be received by the audience and what the interest will be. But it was massive, and it's done, you know, huge numbers, and is continuing to do so in terms of like the engagement online, on social media, and with the documentary as well. And yeah, like I say, I've had quite a lot of people get in touch to say, oh, I'm so pleased that this is finally being covered by the BBC. Because it needs to be talked about and it needs to be covered. And I think that's an interesting one as well, just from like an internal perspective in the BBC, because I would say that initially when I was first pitching the documentary and the story, I did have some editors say, oh, well, like ketamine's been around for ages. It's not a new drug. You know, people have been taking it for a long time. What's the story? What's new about it? So it did take a bit of persuading initially. But luckily I had some editors that, supported the story and believed in it and understood the need to kind of do something on this at the moment. What
people probably do, I mean, there's so many misconceptions. One, people think it's a horse tranquilizer, which it is, but it's been used as an anesthetic since the 70s. It was one of the main anesthetics that they used in the Vietnam War because it's not as bad as opiates for slowing down respiratory breathing and stuff, although, as we know, it can and can cause death if it's really strong. So it's been around for a long time. But I mean, I remember I had a flashback when you was talking earlier of I went to Sanctuary Festival in Winchester Bowl in 2008 when I was 18 years old. And I remember walking around asking for ketamine, and even back then there was a group of people. Actually, I had it quite frequently. A lot of people basically told me to fuck off when I was asking. And one person said, and I remember this really clearly, he said, "Why don't I just give you a shovel and you can dig your own grave?" And this was 16 years ago, that people had this awareness that this is really bad stuff. But it's like you just didn't know. But I do remember seeing some people in the slightly older generation. I mean, it probably only been around for 3 years before that kind of quite mainstream, I think. I think my friends who were quite involved at the time said around 2005 is when it kind of hit the scene. I'm not 100% sure if that's the same all across the country, but certainly in Lincolnshire that was the case. And yeah, and I could see, now looking back, I could see what it had done to them in just 3 years. And the gravity of this drug is that, so I had friends that within a couple of years, they were having these extreme cramps across the whole body that was folding in half, that they had to just basically sit in a bath and they couldn't get out, that were just unbelievably painful. They were having urinary problems, urinating out lumps of their bladder lining and blood and jelly. And, that's in 2 years of using this drug. And then, worst case scenario, people having their bladders removed and ending up with a urine bag, and and having these I didn't realize the until you did this documentary, how serious some of these treatments that they're actually having for these urinary problems, and they're saying that they're basically life-changing treatments, and the chances of having complications if they have these operations in the it's just you can't, it's just unfathomable. A girl in the 20s having to have colostomy bags. Is that the right one? No, it's the wrong one, isn't it? It's the other one. It's the other one. The urine.
It's catheters. That said, it's catheters, but then actually, if you have to have your bladder removed because of ketamine use, then they will create a new one using part of your bowel. So actually, it is all connected in a way, and obviously that's really major surgery and has can have a lot of complexities to it as well. And so if you're having that done at 19, 20, 21 years old, which hospitals in the UK are saying they are seeing patients that young with serious bladder issues, then the chances are that is going to have quite a big impact going forward on the rest of your life and the quality of your life as well. And those are the sorts of things I like you say, I just didn't realize the full extent of how bad the impacts could be. And I think, like I say, partly growing up, I knew, to me, when I was younger, ketamine was known as a horse tranquilizer, and people sort of saw it as it wasn't a popular drug, I don't think, when I was, say, in my late teens, early 20s, and certainly from talking to experts working in the drug sector and urologists, they say it was, the late sort of 1990s, early 2000s, ketamine was popular then. Then quite a lot of messaging got out there that actually it can have serious consequences. It wasn't so popular for a while. And then in the last 5 or 6 years, particularly last 3 or 4, it's really grown in popularity for a variety of reasons. And there seems to be this idea that it's a safe drug. And I think, like we've talked about, because it's used in medical settings as an anesthetic, but also to treat some mental health conditions as well, it gives people this idea that, if it's used in medicine, it must be safe to take, right? But the reality is there's a massive difference between taking it in a controlled medical setting to obviously using it recreationally. And then also, obviously, how addictive it can become as well. And once you start experiencing those urinary problems or bladder pain, that actually the only thing that helps is to take more of the ket, and then you get into that cycle that is just really hard to get out of, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to look it up here, but I'm probably not going to manage it on the spot. But I mean, I know it's in a category of safe medicine, isn't it? Basically, I can't remember the name of that medicine, LD something. But basically, the medical pharmaceutical industry says it is safe to use, and it is in small doses, right? But in large doses, it's absolutely not. And there's another myth that it's not addictive, it's not physically addictive. And I have so many friends who are addicted to heroin or have been addicted to heroin who just say that getting off ketamine is so much harder than heroin, despite it not having the physical withdrawal symptoms like nausea and sickness and the physical sensations that you have coming off heroin, the actual physical withdrawal. But, make no mistake, it does change your brain chemistry, and if it does that, that's physical changes in the body. It's extremely physically extremely powerful as well, but in a different way. So thank you for talking about it again. One of the things that, watching the documentary seemed a little less covered, and I wondered why, is what you can actually do about the addiction, like how to treat ketamine addiction. Was there, in the research process, was that something you was focused on and struggling to find, or?
I think we tried to cover it a bit in terms of the story. So there's a woman we spoke to as part of the documentary, Pagan, who has recovered from a 12-year addiction. And we went to see her and talk about her recovery journey. And it was really important to have that element of positivity and hope, and also your story as well, James, obviously talking from your perspective in terms of the podcast that you do, the work you've done, what you've seen in New Zealand and Australia, but also your own journey as well. We really wanted to feature those elements of positivity and hope for people, because one of the bits of feedback that the BBC gets generally is that often we present our audiences with issues and problems and say, look, this terrible thing is happening, but we don't actually present any solutions, or we don't show elements of positivity. And that is so important for the audience. So it was really key to kind of have that in there. I guess in terms of the actual ins and outs of what you can do, I think the reason we didn't go so much into that is because we were trying to make the documentary speak to as many people as possible. And I guess lots of people watching it or engaging with some of the news articles wouldn't necessarily have used it or struggled with ketamine addiction. And if you get too focused on that, sometimes there's a sense that we're kind of not making it broad enough for the whole audience, if that makes sense. It's really difficult. And I don't think we ever get it right. You can't get it right, but trying to make something speak to an audience that know nothing about something, but also making it interesting and engaging to people that do as well. And so I think that's kind of maybe why we didn't go into more of that, is just trying to find that balance somewhere. But I totally take your point, and I think it is so important that we have that. And the BBC always likes at the end of documentaries to for us to kind of mention the BBC Action Line, which is available online. There's where you can find kind of advice and support and other information and things, just because often within a short space of time, whether that's a half-hour documentary or a news article, you're quite limited in how much you can get into that. And so we try to point audiences in the right direction. But I 100% think it would be good to do more on that where possible.
Yeah, I see your point entirely there. Is not everybody's going to have used it, and I actually think that it's really it was really important just to raise awareness around the impact of it, and scare people, so that as many people as possible do watch it and do get some awareness of how it's not a fun, silly thing that you can just do on a Tuesday night or Wednesday night or whatever, or after uni with your mates, and and all that sort of, because it seems so fun and so harmless when you first start doing it, unless you have too much, it scares the hell out of you. But if you just if you're not overdoing it, it's really so much fun in the beginning. And I describe it as like going down a water slide, not being aware that there's barbed wire at the bottom. It's just all barbed wire at the bottom, and you're like, woo, and you just, you've no idea what's at the bottom of that slide. Yeah.
I think that's a great analogy. And I think also that whole idea of like scaremongering people as well. Like, we have to be really careful in the BBC that we're putting the information out there, but we're not like scaremongering, and we're not making something out kind of to be worse than it is. So that's one thing we have to be aware of. But the other thing is also that we're trying to engage audiences of all ages, right? So we're trying to talk to maybe parents that might have kids using cat. We're trying to talk to grandparents that might have kids using it, but we're also trying to talk to people that are using it themselves as well. And so there's that fine balance between trying to give people the information and kind of make them aware of the risks, but also not trying to tell people not to do something, because ultimately, like, that's never going to work. But also we're just going to like switch our audiences off if we do that as well. And that was something I definitely learned a lot about when I worked at NewsBeat, working on like Radio 1 Extra Nation Network. As I say, our target audience being like kind of under 25s. It's like you want to speak to your audience who, there will be lots of people obviously like using and taking cat, and you're trying to speak to them as well. So you constantly, when you're making, whether it's a documentary or a story, you're thinking about all those things all the time. And like, it's really hard to strike that balance. And obviously whatever you do, I think you'll always get like criticism, and people say, well, you could have done this differently and things. And absolutely we could have done, but we're just always trying to think about all those different viewpoints and be as fair as we can. And like, we absolutely don't always get it right, for sure. But it's just trying to be like as inclusive as we can, and also hear from as many different people as we can as well, which is why it was really important to me to try and speak to somebody that had been a dealer of cat as well. And we spoke to an ex dealer. She stopped doing it about a year ago, but I really wanted to include that voice to kind of hear from her a bit more about like why she was dealing in the first place, but also kind of put to her whether she ever worried about the impact that obviously it can have on people as well.
Yeah, I was a dealer as well, and it was interesting watching that and reflecting on those things. It's most people. I never intended to become a drug dealer. It was an accident. It's just the fueled by the addiction and also the ego. It's a really interesting phenomenon being, especially when you've been unpopular and then you sell drugs, you become the most popular person. Very superficial. They're not your friends, but it's really interesting, and you get tangled up in an absolute mess of, it's really interesting how you can get tangled up in these things by your insecurities and also your lust for the drug itself. And it's like I said in that radio interview, it's like you care about these people, but the drug just takes over, and that desire to do the drug almost eclipses your compassion, basically. It's not that it's not there, it's just eclipsed by this overwhelming, it's like overwhelming desire to do something. It just makes everything else go quiet. It's not visible anymore.
The two cat chronic users that we had, Beth and Jay, in the film, that was again like one of the reasons we really wanted to hear from people who are right in the midst of struggling with addiction and like living it right now, because what you just described, it was like we wanted to be able to like show and hear that from people kind of in it right now as well. And so that was quite, an important part of it as well. But I appreciate I'm taking this in a different direction now, but can I ask you the question that I put to the dealer, like when you were dealing, did you ever think about the consequences that the drugs that you were dealing could have on people or not, because of all the things you've sort of talked about and described? Just interested.
Didn't know in the beginning. Didn't really know what the consequences were gonna be. Addicts have such little ability to do consequential thinking. It's something that we have to teach addicts, is consequential thinking, to think about consequences, because you are so in the moment. You are so in the moment. The majority of your life is spent becoming overwhelmed by discomfort and then being forced to get the next hit one way or another, and your life becomes about that. And then when it's not about that, you're high. So it seesaws between, I am so uncomfortable, I'm so anxious, I'm so irritated, I'm so absolutely being sent mad. I describe it as like there being a scream stuck inside you, constant scream. And then you're overwhelmed and coerced by this discomfort to get the next hit. Then you get the next hit, then you're not thinking. So it's basically a to and fro between those two things. That's life. And like, it's really funny because when you're high, you can be so loving, so-called, so compassionate, chemically fueled compassion, and just like really to those around you, not your family so much, and the ones that you're neglecting. And neglecting is the right word for that. You've totally forgotten about them in most cases. And then, so it's basically stuck in this vicious cycle. When I got a little bit older, well, actually I got caught dealing, and my mum had to kind of like guide me through Crown Court when I was 19. And I crashed my car. I'd never had Valium before. My friend gave me some Valium and I blacked out, and I'd been found in a bush shivering with blue lips, and just something like, I don't know, it must have been winter, I guess. And they put me back in my car, and I said I was going to go to sleep, and I didn't. I drove off. I don't remember anything. I'd never consciously driven in a state like that, but I don't remember. And I actually crashed into the back of someone who was put at the traffic lights. But I tried to stop. I got down to maybe like 3 miles an hour, and I just kind of like bumped into the back of them. And then the police ended up like trying to get me out of the car. I just couldn't do anything. I was like jelly. I don't remember anything. And my mum, this was all in the newspapers in my local town. And my family has a small business in the town. So it was just like, boy from garage, does all this stuff. And totally, like the amount of shame that I put my family through was mind-boggling. And the amount of hassle that I caused them, I was a real pain in the arse. Like it's really bad. But I was like, it's funny because I was never like a malicious person. It wasn't like I was trying to do harm, but I was actually doing the harm that I was doing was by me being so ignorant and so selfish. Like, because I thought if I was just doing what I want and I'm not hurting anyone else, it wasn't like I'm hurting someone. It's just like, no, I'm just doing what I want to do, what I feel like doing. I'm just having a good time. I'm riding the high, just doing what's the most fun at any particular given moment. I didn't realize how much you can hurt people by doing that. I had no idea. Did I answer the question? I can't even remember what the question was. I've been rambling.
Yeah, no, you did answer the question. No, you definitely did. Thank you. And like, was just interested to know, because obviously your experience of dealing was quite different from the ex-dealer I spoke to for the doc, who she's not been addicted to any drugs. She tried lots of different drugs, but she's never struggled with addiction. Whereas I'd spoken to a couple of other ex-dealers who'd all, like you, had struggled with addiction themselves, and that's kind of what had led them into it. Whereas it was quite interesting hearing from her, because actually it wasn't through her drug use that kind of led her into dealing. It was basically because she needed the money, and that's how she like ended up doing it. And also it was really interesting hearing from her as a woman as well. And she said that she kind of built up quite a niche because as a woman, she was dealing to, she's a young woman as well. She was dealing to other young women, and that she found people would trust her in a way that maybe they might feel wary of going to a dealer that was that bit like older that they didn't know. So it was quite interesting. Like we didn't include all of that in the doc just because we didn't have time, but it was quite interesting sort of hearing that perspective on things as well.
It would be great if you could do like an extended edit for YouTube. I don't know if the BBC had let you do that, but I'm sure you could put together something that was an hour long that was more in depth. I don't know if you're allowed to do that, but I'm putting that one
so
out
YouTube,
there.
so I would love to do that. But interestingly, the BBC YouTube have said they want to take the doc, but they want to take it at 80%. Apparently this is like a rule within the BBC that they only take stuff at 80% of its original length. So it would actually be a bit shorter than it is. I don't know the reason behind that, and I don't really understand it either, because it feels like we've gathered all this material, which we really had to struggle to cut down, and it would be great to obviously put a bit more of that out there. But there's certainly things that, I spoke about with different people that I'd love to kind of pick up and follow up on in the future as well, because I feel like there's so many more, so many other interesting bits and things to still look into.
Do you think if there was a petition that they might consider doing it a bit longer if they saw that there was a kind of like a demand for it?
It's a very good question. There's definitely no harm in giving it a go, but I'm not sure. It's one of those rules that I don't know the reason behind it, but apparently it's this quite strict rule they have within BBC News. It must be something, I'm assuming, to do with licensing, but I don't know the ins and outs, if I'm honest, about why that is. But yeah, it's a shame in some ways, because we could quite easily make something that's double the length maybe as what we as the time we had, with some of those other interesting elements we just didn't get a chance to cover in the half-hour doc.
I'll talk to you about that later. I'm not going to bully you right now.
Come back to that. Yeah,
I'm going to write down a long doco.
I'll give you some of the senior people on the BBC's contact details, and you can see how you get on with them.
Yeah. So, what were some of the most interesting insights and perspectives that you gained from experts in addiction or medicine or psychology or anything whilst filming the documentary?
So specifically the experts, rather than
anything, if you like,
the people, anything. Okay, because for me, I think whenever I make anything, the standouts of what I learn are always from the people who've had the experiences. Obviously the experts were all brilliant and tell you so much, but I just think you learn so much directly, from one-on-one. And Beth and Jay, who we filmed with, who are struggling with addiction at the moment, I just learned so much from them about their obviously their background in terms of how they ended up struggling with addiction, but also going through it, the physical impacts it was having on their lives, and also then for them trying to get off it, but how difficult that is. And I think the power of hearing that from them directly going through it at the moment, really, really stayed with me. And it stayed Ross, who I worked with really closely on the documentary. He was the cameraman, and sort of, I guess, co-producer as well. We spent a whole evening with Beth and Jay, and I think both of us, we really enjoyed our time with them, and felt really we learned a lot from them, and a lot of compassion from with them in terms of what they're going through as well. So I just think sometimes addiction is so misunderstood, and I think they both put it across so well in terms of what they're going through at the moment as well. So that was definitely a couple of the standout moments. And then also Claire Rogers, who talked to us about her son, Ryan, who I know you and James had contact with Ryan when he was still alive, and Claire subsequently as well. And, she now is so keen to kind of talk about Ryan's story and his struggle with addiction. And she really wants to raise awareness, and she set up a Facebook group and a WhatsApp group for other families where they've got someone struggling with addiction, which is just I think such an amazing and brave thing to do, like bear in mind everything she's been through and losing Ryan. And she's got a petition for ketamine to be reclassified from a B to an A as well. And so for me, it's like those stories that really stand out. And that's what I really learn from, as much as like the experts tell you all the really important things you need to know about, like nothing quite cuts through in the same way that hearing from the likes of Beth, Jay, Claire, you, Pagan does, because actually it's like you've lived through it and you can give a totally different perspective. So I would say, obviously the experts, and hearing from like the guy we spoke to a guy from the UN Drugs and Crime Agency who talked about ketamine production in parts of the world and the way it makes its way around the world was obviously fascinating to hear about. And speaking to the urologists, the doctors kind of, seeing how many young people in the UK are getting addicted and hearing more about the impact it has on the bladder, all of that was really important context, but nothing cuts through, in my opinion, in a way that people who've experienced or are experiencing the impact of ketamine addiction does. And yeah, that's those people. And I think to me, you and Jay and Pagan and Claire, you are the experts because you've got that firsthand experience.
Yeah, it's interesting as someone who works in addiction on the professional side of it as well. It's interesting because it requires healing from addiction. It's like there's no button to press. There's no person to see. There's a journey ahead of you. And it requires great determination in the face of unbelievably confusing ambivalence where you simultaneously really hate this drug, everything about it you want to give up, absolutely 100%, you are sick of it, and then at the same time you absolutely love getting high on this drug, you love all your friends, you love all the things that you do, and you absolutely 100% want to keep doing it. It's like a car in full foot to the ground, full throttle in both directions, pulling you both ways at the same time. It's mental. That's so you need to be open to getting sober, and you need to be actively seeking that out, even if you can't stop, and at the same time engaging in harm reduction processes. It's not harm reduction or abstinence, it's both of those things. You start trying to look after yourself, you make yourself as healthy as possible all the time in all of your decisions through life. So you're eating better, you're drinking lots of water, you're making sure you get out and get some daylight, doing all those things, even if you still can't stop. And then you're going to see the people to ask how to stop, even if you still can't stop. Just using isn't if you actually want to get sober, just because using isn't failing. You've already been using for ages. Yeah. Keep going for it, keep doing the work, go check out some 12-step meetings, go see a counsellor, go see your GP, do all the things, go see all the people, do all the things, and keep taking one step at a time towards what you can have faith is your path to sobriety, because it's like, it feels impossible until it's not. It's just like, you never feel like you're going to be able to get sober ever. But eventually people do often get sober, and they felt like it was impossible to them. So it's like, so it's like, it requires people who have been through it with the recovery experience. It requires the professionals, because my God, it's so complicated, and it's so, like an addiction program, like if you actually go into rehab and all the programs and all the cognitive behavioral therapy stuff, and then all the values-based stuff like hope and faith and forgiveness and all the things that you have to deal with. It's like, one of my friends, Tim Lodgen, he is an ex-Marine war veteran, and he was addicted to 27 years. And he said what he realized, the thing about the 12-step program is, it's like, this isn't actually a thing to get people sober. This is actually a thing to help people become a better person. So it's something that actually permeates your entire life and completely changes you. So it's really interesting, like that that to me is something really interesting, and something that I hope that I can at some point maybe make an offering of a documentary to the world at some point on that subject, how to heal from addiction, how to recover it, because it's that, and it's bloody complicated, isn't it? I don't even know, I don't know what your thoughts on that would be, but it's like
it's totally, and it's not like linear either, and it's not like it's not as simple as going, right, I want to get clean and that's it, and from here on in it's going to be a journey where it just goes up and up and up. It's like, it's such a roller coaster, isn't it? And that was why as I say, like being able to film and speak with Beth and Jay in the midst of going through their addiction, but also wanting to get clean, it was really important to be able to show that on the one hand, they hate what ketamine has done to them and they really want to get off it. But on the other hand, they love it and they rely on it. And it's so complex and it's all like interweaved as well. And that was like a key for me, being able to show that was like really key as well to, I guess, trying to explain to people that maybe don't have experience or know a massive amount about addiction, like how that works and how it is just such a roller coaster, and you can have like a step forward and then you can have a step back, and it's a long journey as well. And I think that's like, that's part of it, and it's important that we keep talking about that and hear from people like you and other people that have been through it, that are on the other side of it as well, because I think that obviously helps give people that hope when they are trying to get clean, or they're at the beginning of thinking, I want to get off this drug, whatever drug it is as well.
And it's great because
they're addicted to.
Hope really is the first step in recovery. It's number one. You need to have hope that it's possible. And when you see that somebody else who's been in a similar situation to you has walked down a path and they are now sober and even happy, and having a fulfilled life, you can see that that is possible. And you should know that it is possible for you to get sober, because many other people have. And, the wisest thing to do is to walk the path that they've walked. And there's many examples that you can find. And, there's definitely places that you can go and make those first steps. And, a lot of people don't like 12-step meetings, but I think that they're great because there's people there that are sober, and you can get the wisdom from people who have been sober for a long time and say, what did you do? And start doing some of those things. And there's many things that you have to do, many changes that you have to make. So there's definitely a place to start somewhere. Do anything, make a first step. So I'll just ask you a few short questions. So is there any specific policy or social changes you hope that the documentary will inspire regarding like drug education, treatment, or harm reduction efforts?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, you always hope when you make a documentary or you work on something like this that it will lead to some sort of positive change, right? Like ultimately, that is, I think, for a lot of people that work in this industry, one of the main reasons that you do it. I mean, it's a great job. You get to meet so many interesting people and tell people stories, and that is a huge privilege. But you also hope that it can lead to some positive change. And I think for me, the biggest thing, and there's lots of things that I think could change, but I think for me the biggest one is around like probably education, just because what like I kept hearing from the people I spoke to who are struggling with ketamine addiction at the moment is that it was not talked about to them growing up, and they did not realize like the impact that it can have, and that actually getting that messaging out there could potentially make a difference. Like you're obviously never going to stop people from taking drugs. Like that, it's not about that, but it's about making people more aware of the risks and about kind of understanding those risks, and also things like obviously drug testing facilities, which, in the UK, recently in Bristol, which is the city I live in, they announced a regular drug testing service, the first of its kind in the UK, which happens once a month. And so I guess kind of, just making people aware of that sort of thing and about the risks and the impacts it can cause. I think that's key. And as I say, I just heard that from so many of the different people I spoke to was around like education as well. But obviously if it can lead to any form of positive change in the future, or just help like spread the kind of message and awareness, then that's like, that would be great, I guess.
It was something that you asked me. It was one of the questions that you asked me when you interviewed me for the documentary was about that. And I think I said that I hope that it has a similar social tag as heroin. Like when people go, ooh, that's bad stuff, which is how I felt that I'd been treated when I walked around that festival asking for it when I was 18. There was like a real heaviness to it, especially in the South. People were well familiar with it. They knew what it was. They're like, that's bad stuff.
Yeah.
Because I don't think people weren't it wasn't mainstream to be tranquilized. I saw these things flood through the rave scene because we used to organize free parties and raves and stuff. And that's how, you met some of my friends through that documentary, same thing. And like, you just saw this wave of ketamine come through from when everyone was on the MDMA, the Coke, LSD. It was like everybody was real, the vibe was real up. And then all of a sudden it was like Shaun of the Dead. And just the zombies started walking in through the scene, and then all of a sudden everybody's just like, whoa, it's just like the whole vibe of the thing came so heavy and so messy. It was so hard for the whole thing to function, and it just really became an absolute mess. And that's become mainstream. It's in, people are doing this, trying this at school when they're 12 years old. People are doing this in universities. I'm dealing with, I've had people reach out to me who are struggling with their university, who are basically in a crisis because their whole life feels like it's on the line because they're potentially going to have to drop out of uni because they can't function to finish it. And it's like, that's really like how, like, to me, like how that's happened, how a tranquilizer has become a mainstream drug is really, it's really, in one sense it's a mystery, and on the other sense I kind of get it, because it's just been seen really lightly. It's been taken too lightly. Yeah.
Well, like you learn at school, don't you, about like heroin and crack and even things like Coke. I think you know there's like, you definitely learn some things about that. Whereas certainly, I don't know like what it's like now. Obviously, I'm not at school at the moment, but I didn't learn anything about ketamine when I was at school. And certainly from the people I've spoken to, it isn't something that's really taught about. And one of the things that really stuck with me was, from people I spoke to on the Reddit forum, who just said they're living like old people. I mean, someone said to me, like, I'm living like a 90-year-old man and I'm in my early 20s. And it's I guess just, it's that, like, as I say, you don't want to scaremonger and you don't want to scare people, but you also just want to present the reality and the facts and make people aware of that as well. So I think, like, if that could happen, it's interesting. I did a story a few months ago around the drugs testing facility being introduced in Bristol, and I spoke to a woman as part of that whose daughter died she died of an overdose of ketamine and MDMA. She wasn't addicted to the drug or anything. I think she, it might have been the first time she tried it, or she tried it a few times, and she'd been at Boomtown Festival, and she died like 10 years ago now. But anyway, her mum really supports like drug testing in the future, and she watched the ketamine documentary that we did, and she emailed and said, I wish this could be shown in all schools so that like people are just made aware of it. And I think it is just that, like, education is so important. And certainly from the people I've spoke to who are now feeling the effects of what ketamine addiction can do, they say they just didn't know about it when they started using, and they wish they had. And I guess that's where you hope in the future, like maybe it can make a difference to some other people. But I don't know. Is that realistic? Is that me being too optimistic about it? I don't know.
I think it's not. I think that it's realistic. Like I've had opportunities to try heroin in my life, and I have always been like, nah, that's too far for me. I know that there's a boundary there, and I know that I can't step over that one, because if I step over that one is me done. I know it, because I like stuff like that. I like downers. I like things like that. I like disappearing into a little dark black hole. Not anymore, but that was my thing. I didn't want to deal with my problems. If I did heroin, that was game over for me. And I knew that because of the stigma. I knew that was heavy. Yeah. And if I heard that someone was on that, I kind of did that. I kind of had, for people who are listening to the podcast, not watching, it's kind of like a recoil, like I'm just like, ooh. So I do think that that's possible. I do think that's where it's going. And because it's devastating how hard it is to stop doing this. Another thing I spoke about when you interviewed me was like the culture around ketamine. It's like, I think it's very hard to get addicted to this stuff if there's not some sort of accepting culture around it where you have an opportunity, because the first time you do it, it's like so alien and so bizarre that you're just like, you do not want to be in that little control of your body, of your speech, of your ability to function. You can't do anything anymore. It's like you're stuck on the moon. It's bizarre. So to like the first time you do it, you don't want to keep doing that. It's absolutely overwhelming. It's mental. And then you keep doing, if you have a culture around it, you kind of get used to it, and then it becomes fun. Yeah. So it's like if we make it so it's not easy to have these cultures around getting addicted to it, it's going to be a lot harder. But unfortunately, that culture is spreading. It's the culture, the ketamine culture, and I do think that's something needs to be done around that. I do think it's education. I think the harm reduction part's really important with ketamine, and the myths around it as well, because didn't you cover in the documentary that people think that cooking it makes it less harmful, but still, and I believe that for many years I preached this as a ketamine user, and it's not true. The bladder still processes it in the same way, doesn't it? And it still does the damage. So. Yeah,
and it's those things, like you say, that like that's one of those myths, and there are many others that get passed around that actually just aren't true, and people think, oh yeah, if you cook it, it's going to make it safer, it's not going to have the impact, and it's like, actually there's no scientific or medical evidence that says that. And I think another thing I heard from quite a few people who had family members struggling with addiction was that they feel that ketamine addiction is not taken seriously enough, and there aren't the resources in place that there are if, for example, you're addicted to heroin or you're addicted to a Class A drug, because ketamine's a Class B in the UK at the moment. But that, if you're addicted to heroin and you want to get off it, that actually, because it's a Class A, there is support there, and the services are readily available. Whereas I spoke to lots of people either struggling directly themselves or with family members who say that it's much harder to access services and get into rehab or get the support with ketamine addiction. And that, I think it would be great if that could change as well, because certainly that was something I heard from a lot of people, and you hear about the devastating impact it has on people's lives and also their loved ones' lives as well.
I imagine that Bristol is the best equipped in the world for dealing with this. It's probably the worst place in the world for ketamine addiction. I imagine it's the highest rate. It was apparent to me when I was using that Bristol was the ketamine capital of the UK. I don't know about Asia. That's a really interesting scene over there. They've got like ketamine ghettos. It might be worse where they were producing it. They've got like police are addicted to it and all sorts over there. It's really got a real big problem in China with ketamine. So I'm not so sure about that, but I imagine that Bristol is like one of the leading places in the world for dealing with it. What were your experiences with actually like trying to research and get in touch with places that were, I mean, did you try and get in touch with like people who were specialists in dealing with ketamine addiction? Did you find it difficult? Were you surprised by whether it was hard to find that information or not?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like you say, Bristol has I'd say, a reputation for being quite a big, like, drug city anyway. And there's, I think, a rumor about Bristol being like the spiritual home of ketamine, and it first came into the UK in Bristol. I don't know if that's true. I couldn't find anything about that, but that's certainly something I've heard and from a few different people. It's Bristol is one of the cities where one of the hospitals here, Southmead Hospital, has set up this clinic within its urology department to help people struggling with ketamine addiction, because they're seeing so many young people with bladder issues. But it's not the only place in the country. There's certainly an awareness, I would say, from having spoken to lots of different experts and organisations that work with drugs and drug addiction. There's definitely an awareness that ketamine is really popular in the city at the moment. But I guess, like everywhere, whether the resources are in place from the people I spoke to in Bristol struggling with addiction, or with family members struggling, that they were finding it difficult to get the help that they needed. I don't know whether it is like always there. And I think that's not just a Bristol thing. That's probably all across the country. But I think Bristol certainly, in terms of kind of awareness and being across the situation and knowing what's going on, like, Bristol definitely is more maybe forward thinking or more across than other places in the country. I mean, I know I've mentioned it a couple of times, but even the fact that we have this drug testing facility now in Bristol every month where people can go down and get drugs tested, and it gives the people running it an opportunity to kind of obviously analyze the drugs and what is in the drugs that people are taking as well, which is key for understanding like what is in the drugs market and stuff. And so that sort of thing going on in Bristol is obviously that is unique. It's not going on elsewhere regularly in the country, but I think Bristol is no different from probably everywhere else in the country in terms of people struggling with addiction or with family members struggling, saying that it's not easy to get the support they need.
Yeah, I talk to people about this, and it's like you feel like you need somebody who only understands your very unique experience and very unique set of circumstances related to the nuances of the drug that you're using. A lot of those things are physical effects, like people need to understand what's physically going on, the medical side of that. That's not, that's kind of addiction practitioners need to have an understanding of those things. But at the same time, it is also a separate thing. You need to go see the medical people. And Bristol does have like its own specialist urology clinics for dealing with it, doesn't it? Which is like super helpful because they're going to not brush you aside and take it really seriously. And I do. I think that if people are trying to deal with addiction in general, that if you go into a rehab or people who help people with addiction, they understand that fundamentally you have lost control over your willpower to say no to a substance. It's not like you've lost all your control, because you can still do certain things in your life probably, but it's like in that specific area, you cannot control yourself with the substances. And I think anybody who's dealing with addiction, they can help to guide you, to recovery still through that, because it's like everybody shares that thing in common. But it is at the same time, it's really useful to, connect with more peers who are going through the same thing, and like that Reddit forum it's amazing. Like, since I've found that forum, it's just like, it is a wealth of information. It's just like, I'm sure when you found that, you were just like, oh my god, this is the jackpot. And I still feel like that. And there's so many people in there who are helpful, who are, doing kind of like peer-led group chats where you can constantly be talking about these things, sharing experiences, feeling like you're not alone. And believe me, you're not, because like, it's just like, I'm shocked every day by what I'm reading in that forum. It's just unbelievable. The difficulties that people are going through because of this drug. So, there's all these different facets to it. And I don't think people, I don't think people should just be looking for like people who deal with ketamine addiction. I think you can deal with it. People who deal with addiction can address these problems, and you can find the specific things through peer-led things as well, and get those needs met in different areas.
Yeah, I mean, I just totally agree with you on the Reddit forum, in terms of, like, I think it's obviously amazing support to so many people, and like seeing, just going on there and seeing how people struggling with addiction or who'd got clean are then supporting other people is like really just great to see. But also there's so much that you can learn from it as well, in terms of people really openly sharing their own experiences. And I learned loads from it, just from going on there. And I found people were really, generally people were really open and really keen to share their experiences and keen to share advice and things. And I think it's brilliant that sort of thing exists. But just going back to the kind of, reaching out and getting access to support and things. One thing I did hear from lots of the people I spoke to, sort of struggling with addiction, is that often when they were initially reaching out for help, particularly if they're going to, say, a GP surgery, that actually they'd be talking to health professionals who don't really understand, because they're not experts, but they don't really understand the impact of ketamine and the effects it can have on the bladder. And so actually that in itself can be quite problematic, because health professionals can maybe not necessarily give the right advice, or will turn people away, is what I'd heard from lots of people as well. And so I know the British Association of Urological Surgeons are now putting together like a document for other health professionals to spot the signs of ketamine bladder, because they feel it's important that all health professionals are aware of it. And, hopefully when that happens, that can just help in, other parts of the health service, not just within urology, but kind of understand more about the signs to look out for as well. But yeah, that was certainly something I found a lot of people saying it was really difficult to actually, people would be going and talking about their symptoms, and often they'd know more about what ketamine does, more so than the health professionals, which obviously isn't what you expect. But, and like I say, that's where the Reddit forum is, it can be a brilliant source of information, but also, like, more than anything, I think a source of support as well, and for people not to feel like they're on their own as well, which, as you know, is so important to like recovery, right?
Just be careful with the medical advice, because they're not medical professionals most of the time. But they're not scared to give it sometimes.
Yeah, so peer-led, but just in like
peer-led stuff, it's
information,
mind-blowingly amazing. And sometimes the medical information is because they've been through that situation and they do understand it. But when I read stuff, I'm like, I wouldn't probably publish what they're telling me without checking it.
That's a good.
Yeah, but
just some of it in terms of like what it, people talking. I mean, more about like their own experiences and what it's done to them, and sharing that. And I think that is then helpful for other people to say, oh yeah, well, I've experienced something similar as well. And, but yeah, obviously you have to be careful. And that's the other tricky thing as well, in this world we live in now, where, you can so easily find things out, which can be brilliant, but it can also, that can sometimes be really unhelpful as well, because it can then be really easy to, find information that maybe isn't factually accurate or isn't helpful as well. And that can have like a negative in like other ways, have like negative consequences as well. And so that's a really tricky balance between being able to find out lots of useful and helpful info and support, but also knowing that what what you're looking at and what you're finding is correct and accurate as well. And like we talked about, for example, with cooking up your ketamine, that sort of thing where there's this myth that makes it safer, and actually the reality is that's not been medically proven.
It might be nicer for your nose, but it's not nice. It doesn't, in the bladder still processes it the same. I'm confident in saying two things. Harm reduction's good. Look after yourself. 2, getting off ketamine will be really, really beneficial for you. Really confident about saying both of those things. Although it's not hard. It's not easy. It's hard, very hard. It's hard to do, but it's possible. Do it because it's going to be the best thing that you ever do, ever, getting off ketamine. And you can, maximize your chances of living a healthy life, to the best of your ability. There's nothing going to be more beneficial for you than getting off it. And I know how hard that is. Believe me, I do. But it is possible. And you can be happy and completely not wanting to do it anymore. You can be free from the cravings. I don't think about doing ketamine anymore. I never thought that would be possible because it's all I ever thought about. I couldn't get out of bed without it. It was so hard. It's possible to do it. Many people have done it. So I'll share that Reddit forum in the show notes because it's really important. I will also share BBC Action Line because it's really, really amazing, actually. It's a really cool resource, not just for addiction, but for sexual abuse, for domestic violence. There's a whole heap of things that if you might be struggling with something on there, they have links to loads of different information about people that you can contact about things. So for addiction particularly, there's a whole list of links on there and stuff. So I'll share both of those things. So thank you so much for coming on the show today, Rachel. It's been really nice having you. Is there anything that you would like to share as a final takeaway?
Well, just thank you so much for having me and for asking me to do this. And I guess I just want to say thank you to the people that took part in the documentary and, also the people that maybe shared their experiences that didn't want to be recorded or filmed as well, because that was really key to making it. And I guess I probably just want to finish by saying that I think it's really inspiring to hear from people like you, James, and other people that have been through it and are now trying to do something positive and help other people as well. And just keep doing what you're doing, because I think it's amazing. And it's been great to work on this documentary, and I've met so many amazing, inspiring people. And it's a huge privilege to do it. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, Rachel. Listen to the show and hit subscribe to free yourself from the shackles of the mind. And if you find some benefit, please share it with a friend and let's make the world a better place together.